The Donner Reed Party was not the first group of immigrants to attempt a wagon crossing of the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains into California. The wagons and many of the immigrants never made it. Previously, there were several attempts to cross overland into Alta California, each of which abandoned their wagons before crossing the mountain range, the successful ones eventually arriving by horseback or on foot. 2 years prior to the Donner Reed Party, the Stephens-Townsend-Murphy group left Oregon-bound immigrants in Idaho, intending to follow what little remained from a previous trail down into Nevada, reaching the Humboldt River and following it west to California. It was only with the help of a Native American chief who guided them from the Humboldt Sink to the Truckee River before they blazed a trail, following the river up past what is now called Donner Lake and over the summit, becoming the first to actually complete the journey with their wagons. The Stephens-Townsend-Murphy party had no previous trail to follow, only the word of a Native American chief, and like many at that time, used the rivers and streams as their highways. They essentially followed the Truckee River west up into the mountains until they reached where the river turned southerly and intersected with a tributary to Donner Lake. Following the river required many crossings in the ice-cold water, each time climbing the riverbanks. Feet of the livestock were beginning to suffer from spending too much time in the water. Members of the party were nearing exhaustion. It was the middle of November, 1844. Cold weather had arrived and snow was already on the ground. After 8 months on the trail, what remained of the livestock was beginning to falter and supplies were becoming scarce. Time was of the essence. Decisions had to be made. The first decision was to divide the party into 2 groups. A smaller party of 6 individuals left on horseback, following the Truckee River south, and reportedly were the first non-Native Americans to stand on the shore of Lake Tahoe. The remainder of the group chose to continue west around Donner Lake to cross the summit. When they began their journey, there were 11 wagons. Now they only had enough healthy livestock to continue with 5 wagons in the attempt. 3 men chose to remain behind at the lake to guard the remaining wagons and belongings until the others returned with supplies. 2 of those men later left to catch up with the wagons, leaving 17-year-old Moses Schallenberger, who volunteered to remain alone until rescue. It was Schallenberger's cabin near the shore of Donner Lake, where members of the Donner Reed Party sheltered 2 years later. It took this remaining group over a week to reach the foot of the summit in the weather and snow, only to be faced with a formidable granite wall. They found a small gap which allowed them to lead the livestock through one by one. They unloaded all the supplies and carried them through the same gap before dismantling each wagon. Using ropes, chains, and livestock, they hauled each wagon box up and over the wall, where they reassembled the wagons, hitched up the livestock, and proceeded to continue west. Yet, despite the eventual success of the Stephens-Townsend-Murphy party, why did the Donner Reed party choose to take a different route from Truckee Meadows, now known as Reno, during their well-documented and ill-fated attempt to cross the Sierra mountain range just 2 years later? Why not follow the Stephens-Townsend-Murphy route since they were successful? Those are the type of questions we will explore today. Caleb Greenwood, an experienced and elderly mountain man, accompanied the Stephens-Townsend-Murphy party as a guide during their journey, and in 1845 he ventured back into the Sierras, searching to avoid all the difficult river crossings from the year before. That is when he discovered the alternate route leaving the Truckee River, from where the town of Verde, Nevada is now located, proceeding northerly and westerly through Dog Valley before turning southerly again to arrive at Donner Lake. This is the route we will follow today. Our journey begins where immigrants made their 27th crossing of the Truckee River, heading into the surrounding mountains. Now known as Crystal Peak Park, there is a historical marker memorializing this crossing. You can see a glimpse of the river in the distance, where it is likely that the wagons crossed. This is the first of several markers installed and maintained by ExploreWest in this video. They are a non-profit organization formed in 1970 for the purpose of preserving evidence of the California overland trail routes through California and Nevada. One of several organizations dedicated to preserving this important aspect of U.S. history. I'll put more information about ExploreWest in my video description, along with several other important links to more information on the immigrant stories. Our drive begins on Dog Valley Road outside of Verde, where we leave the California-Nevada state line marker, following Greenwood's route to Dog Valley. The gap seen in the hills is the immediate destination for the Donner Reed party. Next, we come across another ExploreWest marker, showing us the location of the wagon trail. Walking along a portion of this wagon trail, I found it interesting that the quote on the marker describes seeing some trees 6 feet in diameter. I see very few, if any, trees of that size today in this general area and wonder why. Perhaps the Emigrant was influenced by stories he had heard about giant trees in California. Perhaps wildfires were less frequent 180 years ago, which allowed time for trees to grow larger back then. The map of the Donner Reed route shows approximately where preservation efforts have documented evidence of the wagon trail as it relates to the road we're driving on today. Something I've learned along the way about immigrant wagon trails was that they preferred traveling either directly up or down slope in rough terrain. Attempting to cross parallel to a slope was very treacherous due to the high center of gravity inherent to the wagons. For this reason, much of the trail we are traversing today followed the draw below the road, generally trending uphill. Another thing that I learned was that the wagons typically used by the immigrants along the various northern overland trails to California and Oregon were smaller prairie schooners, and in some cases, simple farm wagons. The much larger freight-carrying Conestoga wagons we see in movies were much too heavy for a 2,000-mile journey, requiring much more livestock to pull. More livestock and heavier wagons meant less miles per day and larger supplies of feed to support the increased numbers of the livestock. This would not work for the Oregon and California overland trails, where the journeys required an accelerated pace, typically occurring between spring and fall each year to avoid winter weather, not to mention the unknown sources of grass and supplies to maintain healthy livestock. Not much different than today's overland vehicles, where storage is at a premium and size of trucks, jeeps, and other SUVs are carefully considered based on the terrain and ability to maneuver off-road trails in the western part of the country. As we reach what was referred to by the immigrants as the first summit, you will see a fork in the road. The left fork is Hennis Pass Road, a historical traveled way worthy of its own video, while the right fork leads down into Dog Valley. We will first go left to see where the Donner Reed party turned downhill towards the valley. Remember I mentioned earlier about the wagons preferring to travel directly downhill? We will then go back to the first summit and proceed down to Dog Valley to intersect where the immigrants ended up at Dog Creek. To our left, we can see the continuation of the wagon trail as they descended from our previous vantage point above on Hennis Pass Road. The immigrant wagons continue to proceed down the slope to our right into Dog Valley. Proceeding down this hill into Dog Valley represents what is likely the steepest section of Greenwood's alternate route for the immigrant wagons. From the first summit down to Dog Creek is a little over 400 feet down in elevation within a short distance of travel. Before this, and until the immigrants later reached Donner Summit, the remainder of this alternate route would be considered relatively easier terrain compared to following the Truckee River with all the crossings like the Stephens-Townsend-Murphy group did beforehand. Arriving at the bottom of the slope, we will pick up the immigrant wagon trail again east of where Dog Valley Road crosses Dog Creek. We are on a dirt trail along the southerly side of Dog Valley with Dog Creek alongside our right view. According to my research from Trails West and other preservation organizations, there is a high likelihood that the immigrants followed Dog Creek pretty closely to the west at this point. Off in the distance to our right, we can just see the Trails West marker showing a wagon route near the creek, followed by views of the slope which they previously descended. Now we're moving to the other side of Dog Valley Road to continue following Dog Creek to the west. It is important to note that the trees we are seeing today are not the same trees encountered by the immigrants. Trees at that time were either larger or smaller in size. They could have been less or more dense in number. One thing we know for sure is that the immigrants spent a great deal of time and effort to maneuver between the stands of trees, and in many cases chopped down many to enable the wagons to move through easier. Further west along Dog Creek, the immigrant wagons eventually began a gradual climb uphill, possibly crossing Dog Creek depending on which side they were traveling along, until they reached what was referred to as the second summit. This brings us back to why the Donner Reed Party chose to take a different route in approaching the summit, which is today named for them. Now that I have explored this portion of the alternate wagon route, partially on foot, and by driving? The answers most likely lie with the river and the steepness of the slopes. As we saw in that Emigrant quote near the town of Verde when they crossed the Truckee River for the last and 27th time, the effort necessary to continually cross a free-flowing river many times took its toll on both immigrant and animal. And this was just at that point in the river. Remember that the Stephens-Townsend-Murphy party likely crossed many more times between this point and when they finally arrived near Donner Lake. Also remember that at this point in the emigrant's journey, it was November, with 1 to 2 feet of snow on the ground and ice-cold water. They were exhausted for many months on the trail. While the Donner Reed party had to traverse upslope and downslope along this alternate route, those were relatively gradual grades for the most part, while avoiding the many dangerous river crossings in ice-cold water. Speaking of the Stephens-Townsend-Murphy party, I am sure you'd like to know what became of them after crossing the summit. While there were other obstacles which caused the party delays in reaching Sutter's Fort, all of the members of the Stephens-Townsend-Murphy party eventually arrived. The group of 6 who first left on horseback explored around the west side of Lake Tahoe and eventually followed streams and rivers west to end up at Sutter's Fort a few days before the others. 50 members and 11 wagons left Council Bluffs, Iowa in April 1844, and 52 members arrived alive in California by March 1845, including 2 infant girls born along the journey. Many of those survivors established themselves as prominent citizens in the growth of California as a state in later years. I would imagine that many are more aware of the trials and troubles which the Donner Reed party encountered during their mostly unsuccessful attempt. News during that time was not much different than today, where misfortune and failure garner much of the headlines. Dr. Townsend reportedly kept a diary of the journey of his group, but unfortunately that diary was lost, and much of the knowledge historians have today related to the Stephens-Townsend-Murphy success came from recollections of Moses Schallenberger later in his life. While I explored these trails and researched the history of these immigrant wagon crossings, I couldn't help but compare their efforts to those of the modern overlanding groups. Desire to see and experience the remoteness of this country remains a strong characteristic, regardless of whether that is today or 180 years ago. Despite our modern conveniences and obvious improvements in mechanical means, survival, and safety measures, many today still encounter rough terrain which proves difficult to traverse, maneuvering around trees and rocks, and the ever-present danger of severe weather patterns which could impact the journey. As we arrive to the second summit, we see the next trail's west marker on our left. At this point, the Emigrant Wagon Trail again crosses Hennis Pass Road, somewhat paralleling the same road for a little ways west until departing and heading in a southwesterly direction. Much of the remaining portion of Greenwood's alternate route continued to follow water courses on its way to Donner Lake. Some of the original trail along these water courses are now underwater due to the presence of a couple reservoirs, and also crosses private lands in some places. I look forward to returning again to this area, continuing to explore the remainder of the Emigrant Wagon Trails. Ending on Hennis Pass Road, please stay tuned for a future video exploring the background behind that important trade route, including its role in history, between the time of the first immigrant wagons and construction of the first railroad through this area.